Bonjour, and welcome back to my world history course. This is Professor Philippe Durand, and we're on our way to explore the history of the world before 1500. So far in this first section on antiquity, we've studied Mesopotamia, focusing on scientific discoveries, and also ancient Egypt, focusing on religion. Today, we're moving on to Greece. And there's a lot to say about the scientific contributions made by Greeks, like, Archimedes, and also a lot to say about Greek mythology and religion, because that influenced centuries of Western art. But I want to focus on another issue, which is how Greek city-states were governed, what we would call today political philosophy. As a matter of fact, both of these words have Greek roots. Politics, that's the art of governing the polis, P-O-L-I-S, the Greek term for a city. And as for the term philosophy, it also means something in Greek, the love of wisdom. So let's try to wisely and lovingly study the way that Greek cities were governed from 500 BC to 300 BC, which would be the golden age of ancient Greece. The first thing to remember is that during this period, Greece was not a centralized empire like Egypt or Rome or Persia. The area we now know as the country of Greece was back then divided between dozens of independent city-states or polis like Athens and Sparta, each of them with their own government and their own army. So why do we speak of a Greek civilization then, if the area was not under single political control? Well, because all of these cities shared a similar language, similar values, or similar gods. They were bound by culture. So that culture would distinguish them from non-Greek speaking people whom they called the barbarians. People like you and me, I guess. But the political regimes of these city-states were quite different. Each had their own constitution, you might call that. So to classify them and try to do a taxonomy, I will rely on a Greek political philosopher, Aristotle, whose word politika, or the politics, roughly means about the city, about the government of the polis. Well, because there were so many systems of government in ancient Greece, Aristotle had to do a classification, as I said, a taxonomy. And his guiding principle was how many people are in charge of governing that city. 1, 2, 3, many. And if you had just one person in charge, a king, for example, you had a monarchy. And this was the most common form of government in ancient times, including in some city-states like Corinth. When we speak of monarchy today in a republic like the United States, the term is pejorative, but it was not necessarily bad for Aristotle. It just meant rule by one person. If that omnipotent person was behaving unjustly, then the system was bad. That's a tyranny. But if the ruler was fair, then monarchy was an efficient way to get things done, much more efficient than democracy. And Aristotle may have gotten that idea from his teacher, the philosopher Plato, who also embraced the concept of a philosopher king. For Plato, the teacher of Aristotle, the best form of government was a king, who was as wise as a philosopher, or, failing that, who was advised by a wise philosopher like Plato. Though in practice, enlightened dictatorship proved a bit more difficult to implement than Plato had expected. Plato once went to Sicily to act as advisor to the local tyrant of Syracuse, and that experiment ended in a disaster. So the second form of government would be ruled by not one, but a few people. Again, no judgment call, that could be good or that could be bad. You could either have aristocracy, which is ruled by the best and the brightest, the most virtuous, or oligarchy, which is ruled by the wealthy and the well-connected. So when I read Aristotle, I really got the feeling that he favored aristocracy, the rule by a small group of smart philosophers like him. He comes across to me as a bit snobbish or elitist, sometimes frighteningly so. For example, he saw that couples should have been children that were deformed cripples because they were inferior human beings. Just toss those kids out to die of exposure. And sure, abandoning unwanted infants was pretty common in ancient times. Heck, it was practiced in China until pretty recently. But when I read Aristotle, I can't help but think of eugenics as practiced by the Nazi regime or the concept of a master race. So the third and final form of government would be ruled by the people according to a social compact, constitutional government, ruled by the many. And this is a form of government favored in Western societies today, like my native France or the US. But again, Aristotle thought it could be good or bad, depending on circumstances. And Aristotle was really afraid that democracy could evolve into mob rule if some populist demagogue unleashed, the base instincts of the populace. So there you have it, 3 types of government: monarchy, oligarchy, democracy, depending on how many people are in charge. I will leave the issue of monarchy aside today because it wasn't particularly unique to ancient Greece. So instead I'll focus on the more unusual cases of democracy and oligarchy by studying the 2 most powerful Greek city-states of the time, Athens and Sparta. So Athens was located on the peninsula of Attica. The city was bunched up around the hill of the Acropolis, which means, well, just that, the high part of the city. And as for the name of Athens, the whole city, that came from Athena, goddess of war, wisdom, and protector of the city. Athens, if you look at the map, that was pretty close to the sea, the Aegean Sea, and so it was always drawn to things that were maritime. It had a large fleet of triremes, it had merchant ships, it also had a large population for its time, and those could be employed as sailors on these ships, as oarsmen, or those excess people could be sent overseas to found colonies all around the Mediterranean Sea. Athens was also a center of Hellenistic culture, Greek culture, and so you had many foreigners who came to visit, to see the Parthenon or learn Greek or talk to the philosophers. So think of it as a New York City today, a nexus of trade, finance, and culture with a large cosmopolitan population, a city of the world. The existence of that large and often poor population put pressure on authorities in Athens so as to accommodate the demands of the masses. And so that eventually led to democracy, which is ruled by the demos, by the people. And I must immediately add a caveat and note that the concept of the people was narrowly defined in Athens. There were about 300,000 people in Athens and its vicinity, but only a tenth of those were full-fledged voting citizens. Because to be a voting citizen, you had to be an adult, above 18, okay? But you also had to be a citizen, which was narrowly defined. You had to be born of 2 Athenian parents, otherwise you'd be a foreigner, a metic, as they called it. Women were also excluded from the voting public. In fact, Athenian society was among the most sexist of ancient times. Women were expected to stay quiet, have babies, and spend their days in the room of the house reserved for women, the gynecium, which is where we get the word gynecologist today. And to be a voting citizen, you also had to be free, because Athens, like other Greek city-states, had slavery, which might seem like a contradiction. I mean, after all, how could a government predicated on the concept of equality for all tolerate slavery? But Athenians themselves, they saw no contradiction. For one thing, many slaves in ancient Greece had been captured in wars with the enemies of Athens, so those slaves would have been foreigners anyway. And also, being a good citizen, that took time. You had to spend time on the agora, the marketplace, to discuss politics with your neighbors. You had to participate in the assembly meetings. You had been doing jury duty, fight in times of war. All that was easier to do if slaves did all the dirty work for you. And in our present-day political system, work is valued. US politicians often claim to help, quote, hard-working American families, right? Well, for Athenians, work was more of a drudgery, some kind of annoying thing that you had to do to make a living. And calling someone hard-working would have been an insult, like calling him a schmuck. So ideally, you'd be rich enough not to have to work so that you could focus on philosophy, the arts, politics, debate, or war, and that worked better if your wife did all the work at home or the slaves did. So how did democracy work in practice? The key institution was the assembly, which gathered every 10 days or so. And that would be the equivalent of our US Congress today, with one big difference. The US today has over 300 million people, so we have a representative democracy. We elect 535 people to represent us in Congress. Athens, however, was small enough that they could have a direct democracy where every citizen could attend the assembly in person. To my knowledge, this system is only practiced today in some small counties in Switzerland, because modern democracies, like, I don't know, France or the UK, they're simply too big for that. So if you visit the Acropolis in Athens today, and you should, it's a beautiful place that's pretty jam-packed with history, well, you'll see the assembly at a distance. It's in a rocky hill nearby, a hill big enough to accommodate thousands of people in the open. And every citizen who wanted to attend, well, just could. And as in our democracy, many citizens chose not to vote, and so in order to boost attendance, the police in Athens would go around the agora, the marketplace, to round up all the loafers who prefer to drink, I don't know, an ouzo with their friends instead of doing the citizenship duty and going to the assembly. So to do so, the police would use a rope dipped in paint to corral those who were tardy and then push them towards the hill of the assembly. And then all these tardy people would show up at the assembly with the stigma of having stains on their clothes. Not quite the scarlet A, but the scarlet stain. And so after that, whoever wanted to speak at the assembly could do so, as long as their lungs were strong enough, because things could get pretty loud and raucous. No loudspeaker back then. For that reason, the art of speaking in public, rhetoric, was a key part of the education of the Athenian elite. Anybody who was somebody in Athens had to know how to command the attention of thousands of people with a good, rousing speech. And then after the speeches, people voted, and that decision became Athenian law. You're probably familiar with the division of powers as described by the French philosopher Montaigne, the legislative power, executive, and judicial. And by that standard, the assembly was the legislative body of Athens. Actually implementing the law, the executive power, that took more day-to-day work. You couldn't expect everybody to show up for that, so a smaller body was set up called the Council of 500 because, well, it had 500 people. Those 500 people were not elected, they were chosen at random. And you might find this odd because in the US we like to elect everybody, including people like, I don't know, assessor or alderman, where we're not even sure what they're doing. But the Athenians thought that electing people wasn't always the best system because you would always end up with famous, rich people who could afford to campaign. So it wasn't that democratic. Choosing by lot was better. And to some extent, they were right. Think of the US Senate today. How many millionaires do you have in it? And the answer would be 100%, including many billionaires. How many doctors? How many businessmen? How many lawyers? A lot, a majority. How many waitresses, janitors, hourly workers from McDonald's? 0. So our representative democracy is not exactly a representative. It's governed by the rich, kleptocracy in a way. To avoid this, the Athenians placed the whole population into 10 groups that they called tribes, and then drew 50 names from each group at random. This way you'd have a few sailors from the port, some farmers from the countryside, and a bunch of people from different social ranks, including rich people. The danger, of course, from that system is that some mentally incapacitated person, i.e. a complete moron, might be selected at random. But every person had to be vetted by a community that made sure that their IQ was high enough to serve in public office. Again, a system from which we might want to borrow someday. So then you had some more specialized executive offices like the 10 strategoi. They oversaw the army and the fleet, which is where we get the term strategy. Some of these strategoi were elected, but the term of these officials tended to be short, often just 1 year. Because the great fear was that if a person was elected to a long term and then re-elected forever, which is often the case in our Congress today, then they might lose touch with the people and become more of an oligarchy. The third branch of government, the judicial branch, was ancestor of our jury system. Athenians feared that a rich defendant could easily bribe a judge, so they selected very large juries. I'm talking hundreds of people, so that it would be difficult to bribe all the members before trial. So you've noticed by now that Athenians had great faith in the people of the whole, democracy, but they had little faith in the specific individuals that were part of that people, because they thought maybe they were going to be too dumb or too ambitious or too corrupt. And that's a strange dichotomy there that explains why they had so many safeguards. Ostracism was another example of justice in Athens, and also of how afraid Athenians were of losing their democracy. And usually the procedure for ostracism did not start with a crime. Instead, every year the assembly would be asked if they wanted to ostracize somebody. And ostracize, if you don't know the term, it means to shun, to exile somebody. So if the vote for that was yes, then the members of the assembly would look for a guilty person after the fact, and they would write on a piece of broken pottery the name of the person that they considered to be the most dangerous in the city. Not a criminal, really, more like an ambitious politician who might end up a tyrant if left unchecked. So if enough people voted for that person, then that person would be ostracized, exiled for a period of 10 years, long enough for things to cool down a little. A piece of broken pottery in Greek was called an ostraka, which is the term where the term ostracize comes from. In a way, Athenians potterized somebody out of town, the same way that people in the Old West might tar and feather somebody out of town. Let's finish our walk through ancient Athens by covering yet another unusual trial, the trial of Socrates. Socrates was probably the most famous philosopher in Athens ever, even though he never wrote a book, because he preferred doing what I'm doing now, public discourse. So we only know him because his followers, such as Plato, wrote down what he said. So Plato then became the teacher of Aristotle, the one who wrote the Politics, and Aristotle later became the teacher of Alexander the Great, and it was a conqueror that we'll cover next time. So you had an interesting line of masters and pupil from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle to Alexander. Hopefully that will happen with my own students in the future. Maybe you two one day will conquer the whole known world. Anyway, it's difficult to summarize the thought of Socrates in just a few words because he wrote a lot, or spoke a lot rather. But a major life pursuit of his was to question everything. The unexamined life is not worth living, quote unquote, he said. So like a university professor today, he dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth and knowledge. Note that he wished to find truth through the power of reason and logic, not some revelation from God. So his philosophy was a secular one, where the human mind alone could penetrate the secrets of nature without resorting to mythology to make up the gaps. Socrates was often at odds with another group called the Sophists. These were a group of philosophers who were hired by the rich to teach rhetoric to their kids, the art of public speaking. And according to that group, the Sophists, with the right techniques of public speaking, you could prove any point. The same way that today you would hire a lawyer to defend your case, whether you're guilty or not. This meant that the Sophists were rather cynical. With the right rhetorical tricks, they thought that they could prove that up was down and black was white, and that in the end there was no such thing as right or wrong. So they had relativistic ethics, which really upset Socrates. Because he was on a lifelong mission to find the truth, the one and only truth. So Socrates, who was always unkempt, dirty even, didn't care for money, and he taught for free. Whereas the Sophists, they were highly paid fops, so that's another reason for their little feud. So as I said, Socrates did not write hefty treatises like the Politics of Aristotle. He liked to talk, preferably with his rivals, the Sophists. He often didn't present his ideas from the get-go. Instead, he preferred to ask a general question like, what is art? How do we decide that something is beautiful and should be put in a museum and something else is kitschy? Well, that's a good subject for debate. And so the Sophists would offer their own opinion on the origins of art. And Socrates would counter, saying, well, what about that counterexample? So the Sophists would refine an argument, and Socrates would counter and force them to change it again through that process of back and forth. Until by the end of the debate, the Sophists would end up arguing the exact opposite of what they had started with, which had been the plan of Socrates all along. That was a way to prove his point, but also to humiliate his rivals. So that's called the Socratic method, reaching knowledge through a back and forth, a dialogue. And that's been very influential in the field of education, where many educators today think it's kind of old-fashioned to present things from the top down, to deliver a lecture and expect students to memorize everything, rote learning. Instead, educators should get students to participate, weigh in, because ultimately the students already know the material. You just have to get it out of them. So basically the exact opposite of what I've been doing so far in the class, where I've been pontificating and expecting you to take notes so that you know that for the test. But don't worry, we will also have class discussions where you'll get to discuss primary source documents like the Politics of Aristotle. So Socrates was very popular with young men who followed him everywhere he went, like a fan club. There was no formal university in Athens, so joining the fan club of Socrates was the closest you could ever get to being a philosophy major. Those young men would then come home and try the Socratic method with their parents at dinner time, and that didn't always play well with them, which is why ultimately Socrates was put on trial. He was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens by teaching them to rebel against authority and to question everything. Socrates was also accused of impiety. Remember that his philosophy was purely secular, which was an insult against the gods. And also he was accused of being anti-democratic, and there I think that was more on point. Because for Socrates, truth was reached through the power of the mind of a brilliant philosopher, not through the will of the popular assembly. So in a way he was an aristocrat of the mind, like Plato and Aristotle after him. So the jury found Socrates guilty. And when it came time to choose a punishment, Socrates just joked that he should get a reward for his actions as punishment. I think he was mad at the joke, but that did not sit well with the jury, so they sentenced him to death as a result. Socrates probably could have fled into temporary exile, ostracism, and then come back later on after seeing it cool down, but instead he chose to remain in Athens, and he killed himself, famously by drinking hemlock. The year was 399 BC. And that's how the world lost one of its most brilliant minds, a victim of close-mindedness, intolerance, and let's face it, his own hubris. Let's now leave Athens for a bit and move to its great rival, Sparta. That town was everything that Athens wasn't. Athens was close to the sea and was a naval power, and it was a land power. Athens was noted for its wealth, its cosmopolitanism. Sparta was dour and inward-looking. Athenians debated everything. Spartans were told to obey. Heck, they weren't even supposed to talk. The political system of the two cities was also starkly different. Athens was a democracy ruled by the people, even though not everybody was part of the people. Sparta was an aristocracy ruled by the few. There was technically an assembly in Sparta, but it was less powerful than it was in Athens, and so far more consequential was the Council of Elders. That was composed of 28 men above the age of 60. And even they didn't really pass laws per se. Spartans were very conservative in the sense of trying to keep things the way they are, and they did not like to change things. So instead, the Council of Elders simply enforced the laws of Lycurgus, a historical figure, partly mythical, who supposedly had set up the whole system of government in Sparta in the first place, and he would never change anything. At any rate, putting old people in charge, like in the Council of Elders, would also guarantee that things wouldn't change too much. In my experience, you don't find that many old people on the barricades waving their cane. Not too many communist grandpas. Then you also had a group of 5 men called the Ephors, E-P-H-O-R-S, and they also held considerable power in Sparta. And then Sparta had kings, not one, but 2, which is unusual and could be quite problematic if the 2 kings disagreed on something. But then again, disagreeing meant gridlock, which meant that nothing changed, and that was perfect for such a conservative society. So if you add everything, the 28 elders, the 5 ephors, and the 2 kings, that means that 35 people held the bulk of the power in ancient Sparta, which is not ruled by one, but definitely not ruled by the many. It's an oligarchy ruled by the few. Spartan society was also an oligarchy in a social sense, because Spartan citizens were a small minority of the Spartan population as a whole. And I'm just talking about like men versus women here. Most people in Sparta were helots, which you can translate as slaves or serfs. They were farmers from nearby areas from Sparta, whom the Spartans had conquered in the past and then used as involuntary labor ever since. So that meant that Spartans were always at risk of being overwhelmed by their own people. And actually each year the ephors even declared war on the helots so that this would allow free Spartans to kill any helot with impunity. And revolts were always a risk, especially in times of war, when many of the men were gone. So for that reason, Spartan women were taught how to fight and were given far more independence than was customary in ancient Greece. So Sparta was a dual oligarchy. A minority of Spartans were citizens, and of those, a handful wielded the bulk of the political power. I told you that in Athens, slavery was seen as a necessary evil that allowed free citizens to spend their time doing what they liked best, like debate, commerce, the arts. Well, in Sparta, too, slavery left free citizens plenty of time to focus on what they did best, and that was war and love. Well, almost love. Key duty of Spartan citizens was to produce offspring, since free Spartans were few and the adults often died in wars. So marriage in that context was purely utilitarian. In fact, it wasn't even a choice. You had to marry by law. You'd be punished if you didn't and rewarded if you did and had a lot of sons. So seducing your bride was not exactly something that entailed roses for Valentine's Day and a big diamond. That's how it worked. A woman of marriageable age would be in her home, her head shaved, dressed like a man. Spartan men would sneak into her house, grab her, carry her into the barracks where he lived with other men, and that's it. Husband and wife. You just save yourself a lot of money on the catering bill. But to a present-day audience, the whole procedure looked suspiciously like kidnapping, with some homosexual overtones to boot, since the lady was expected to dress like a man. So the main purpose of Spartan marriage was not to find your soulmate, but reproduction. Wives were even allowed to take another sexual partner when their husband could not produce an heir, or if he was gone for an extended period of time. What is called polyandry, one wife, multiple male partners. Spartans were also known to toss away newborn babies who were unfit or crippled because these babies would never grow up to be warriors. The same troubling eugenics that we already noted with Aristotle. The nuclear family as we know it was not the norm either. Children were taken away from their parents at a young age and raised in a communal setting, like a barrack. So much so that Spartans often addressed any older man as a father, because in a sense, every older man in town had raised as a community this young soldier. Spartan education was quite different from ours. It was not designed to teach stuff or to promote moral values or to foster the healthy development of a child, self-esteem. No, the goal was to prepare boys for war. So Spartans were taught to obey and to speak as little as possible. And to this day, a person is called laconic if he or she is a person of few words. And that expression comes from Laconia, the province of Sparta, where people were famously tight-lipped. Kids were fed poorly, clothed inadequately, even in the middle of winter, and they were taught to spurn material things. That has given us another word, by the way, Spartan, as an adjective, which means frugal. So if you have a Spartan lifestyle, it means that you live off little. And if you're in the Spartan lifestyle, that would mean that you take a lover when your husband is gone for too long. Refusing to feed and clothe your child properly, that would be called child abuse, right? Well, the Spartans called that toughening up a boy, who one day would have to do with little during a military campaign. Spartan boys were in fact so hungry that they would sneak out of their barracks at night to steal a chicken from the farm of a helot, for example. And if those boys were caught, they would be punished by the elders, not because they had stolen a chicken and theft was morally wrong, but because they had been caught, they had not been stealthy. We'll get back to the military role of the Spartans next time when we discuss the wars against Persia and the Battle of Thermopylae. I'd like to finish this overview of the political systems of Athens and Sparta with a few philosophical musings of my own. What I find fascinating when studying ancient societies is how similar they are to us, and at the same time, how different. Athens is a direct ancestor of our democracy. People still study the classics in college. They learn the Socratic method. They study Euclidean geometry. But then the Greeks lived according to a value system entirely different from our own. One where physical toil was devalued, slavery was okay, women were just baby machine, and in the case of Sparta, you could abduct a wife, kill a baby, and mistreat a child. I don't want to be a sophist and conclude that there is no right and wrong, that everything's relative. There is such a thing as truth and ethics. Child murder is wrong, so is slavery. But studying ancient societies forces us to take another look at our society and always question whether what we're doing is right. whether our democracy is as democratic as it looks, for example. Remember Socrates, question everything because life unexamined is not worth living. All right, well, next time we'll study yet another fascinating civilization, the Persians, and how they battled the Greeks in a series of unforgettable wars. Goodbye, au revoir.